The famous chef had no idea he'd just challenged a Michelin star winner to cook her signature dish. The cameras were rolling as Scott Todd, celebrity chef and host of Kitchen Command, smirked at the quiet cafeteria cook. "You there," he pointed directly at Samantha. "I want you to make canard à la presse. 3 hours." The small crowd gasped. It was one of the most technically demanding dishes in French cuisine. Samantha's hands began to tremble. Not from intimidation but from something deeper, something buried. As the spatula she'd been holding clattered to the floor, a flash of memory hit her. Blinding camera lights, a restaurant kitchen in chaos, headlines screaming, "Disastrous opening," and Chef Hyder disappears after spectacular failure. 8 years of careful hiding threatened to unravel in an instant. The woman who had once been featured in culinary magazines now stood frozen in a community college cafeteria, wearing a hairnet and a name tag that read simply Sam. Every morning for the past 8 years, Samantha Hyder, once named America's most innovative chef, woke at 5 a.m. and drove to the Riverside Community College cafeteria. She'd traded her chef's whites for gray polyester, her name for anonymity, her creativity for safety. The rhythms of institutional cooking became her refuge. Predictable, undemanding, invisible. "Morning, Sam," Darla Morris would greet her, sliding the day's menu across the prep table. Standard breakfast service, nothing fancy. At 65, Darla ran the cafeteria with military precision and motherly protection. She was the only person who knew Samantha's true identity. Had recognized her immediately during the job interview but promised secrecy. "Remember," Darla would often say, watching Samantha's knife work, still impossibly precise despite her efforts to appear average, "the budget doesn't allow for fancy knife skills." It was code between them, hide your light. When cooking scrambled eggs for 300 students, Samantha would catch herself almost adding the precise 3-finger pinch of herbs she once used at her restaurant. She'd stop, swallow the instinct, and reach for the pre-measured seasoning packets instead. The perfect temperature control, the way she could tell doneness by scent alone. These things she could not unlearn, but she had mastered the art of ordinary cooking, deliberate imperfection. At night in her small apartment, she would sometimes stand in her kitchen, hands hovering over ingredients, before sighing and ordering takeout instead. Cooking for herself meant confronting the ghost of who she had been. It was easier to eat food that carried no memory, no expectation, no possibility of failure. In her kitchen drawer lay a sealed envelope containing the only professional photograph she'd kept. Samantha standing beside her grandmother outside their family restaurant in Michigan, both their hands dusted with flour. Her grandmother's recipes remained packed away in a box she hadn't opened since the night her own restaurant closed. "Food doesn't lie, Sammy," her grandmother used to say. "When you cook from truth, people taste that truth." The irony wasn't lost on her that her entire life was now a carefully constructed lie. "This is an incredible opportunity for our college." Ken Hopkins, the community college president, stood before the cafeteria staff, practically vibrating with excitement. Kitchen Command is the #1 cooking show in the country. The publicity alone. He adjusted his tie, a nervous habit when dollar signs danced in his vision. Community colleges can cook too. That's the angle. What Ken didn't say was that the show's premise involved humiliating ordinary cooks by challenging them to create dishes beyond their skill level. The entertainment came from watching them fail while Scott Todd delivered withering commentary. When the production crew began unloading equipment, Samantha felt her chest tighten. Cameras, lights, judgment. Darla immediately tried to intervene. "Sam, I need you to do inventory in the back storage room today. Complete count of everything." Her eyes communicated everything her words couldn't. "I'm protecting you." But at that moment, the morning cook called in sick. 300 students would need breakfast, and filming or not, they had to be fed. Samantha would have to stay. Scott Todd arrived like a hurricane in designer chef whites. His signature red bandana tied around his forearm. His battle flag, as he called it on television. With cameras following his every move. He surveyed the cafeteria kitchen with theatrical disgust. "This," he announced to the cameras, is exactly why America's culinary standards are in decline. Institutional food, prepared without passion or technique. He didn't see how Samantha flinched at his words, nor how Darla's expression hardened. What the cameras didn't capture was Scott nervously reviewing flashcards in his dressing room trailer earlier, reminders of technical terms and classical techniques he'd never properly mastered. His working-class background had denied him the classical training his competitors had received. Every show was a performance designed to hide his insecurities behind bravado. Before I continue with this extraordinary story of hidden talents and second chances, I'd like to ask, do you know someone who's hiding their true gifts from the world? Share this video with them and tell us in the comments about talent you've seen people conceal. Now, back to our story of a chef about to face her deepest fears. This food, Scott announced, dramatically pushing away a tray of Samantha's carefully prepared breakfast casserole, is what happens when people stop caring about excellence. The cameras zoomed in on his disgusted expression, then panned to capture the cafeteria staff's reactions. Samantha kept her head down, focusing on wiping down the counter with methodical strokes. Don't draw attention. Don't engage. 8 years of practiced invisibility had become instinct. For today's challenge, Scott continued, scanning the kitchen staff, I need the most. His eyes landed on Samantha, noting her deliberate avoidance, mistaking it for fear. Basic cook here. Darla stepped forward. Everyone's busy preparing lunch. Maybe another time. Her. Scott pointed directly at Samantha. You there with the cleaning cloth. What's your name? Sam, she said quietly, still not looking up. Well, Sam, Scott's voice carried the smug certainty that made for good television. I'm going to teach America an important lesson today through you. He gestured for the cameras to come closer. Canard à la presse, duck pressed under silver. One of the most technically challenging dishes in French cuisine. Have you ever heard of it? Course she had. Samantha had mastered it under chef Michelin in Paris 15 years ago. It was the signature dish that earned her first Michelin star. The irony would have been comical if the panic hadn't been so real. No, she lied, the word barely audible. 3 hours, Scott announced. All ingredients will be provided. America will see the difference between a cafeteria cook and a real chef. As the production assistants began setting up a cooking station, Samantha slipped away to the walk-in refrigerator, her sanctuary in moments of stress. Inside the cold space, her breath formed small clouds as she pressed her forehead against the metal shelving. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The heavy door opened. Darla stood there, concern etched across her face. Sam! I can't do this, Samantha whispered. The cameras. Everyone watching. Darla placed weathered hands on Samantha's shoulders. It's just food, Sam. In the end, it's just food. But they both knew it wasn't. It was identity. Memory. Everything Samantha had run from and everything she had once been. 8 years earlier, Samantha Hyder had been the culinary world's rising star. The granddaughter of a Hungarian immigrant who ran a small family restaurant in Michigan, Samantha had worked her way through elite kitchens across Europe before returning to America with a vision, modernizing her grandmother's recipes while honoring their essence. Her restaurant, Roots, opened in Chicago to unprecedented anticipation. Food critics had booked tables months in advance. Investors had fought to back her vision after her pop-up events created near-religious experiences for diners. Her grandmother's handwritten recipes, treasured like sacred texts, formed the foundation of her menu. Food is memory, she told Culinary Quarterly in her last interview before opening night. When you taste something truly extraordinary, it creates a memory. But when you taste something that awakens a memory already inside you, that's magic. Opening night began like a dream. The kitchen moved with the precision she had spent months rehearsing. The first courses emerged to audible gasps of delight from diners. But halfway through service, disaster struck. A prominent critic suffered a severe allergic reaction, caused not by Samantha's food but by something he'd consumed earlier. In the chaos that followed, orders backed up. A kitchen fire erupted from an equipment malfunction. By the time emergency services left, the night was in shambles. The critic, embarrassed and angry, wrote a devastating review anyway. Investors panicked and pulled funding. What followed was a very public meltdown, captured by a dozen cell phones and splashed across social media, as Samantha, exhausted and heartbroken, collapsed in her kitchen. Chef Hyder's spectacular flameout, read the headlines. Overrated and overwhelmed, claimed the think pieces that followed. No one mentioned the technical perfection of the dishes that had made it to tables. No one defended the vision. The narrative was set. Another ego-driven chef who couldn't handle pressure. 2 days later, Samantha Hyder disappeared. She withdrew her savings, moved 3 states away, legally started using her maiden name again, and applied for the one job she was certain would keep her hidden: institutional cooking, where creativity went to die. Where no one would ever look for a former Michelin-starred chef. The unopened box of her grandmother's recipes was all she brought from her former life. Too painful to use. Too precious to discard. Back in the present, Samantha stood before the ingredients laid out for canard à la presa. Premium duck, aromatics, cognac and gleaming tools, including an antique silver duck press the production team had brought as a prop. Her fingers twitched slightly as muscle memory stirred. "Your time starts now," Scott announced with theatrical flair, certain he was about to witness a humiliating failure. Samantha's hands trembled as she reached for the duck. 8 years since she'd broken down poultry with proper technique. 8 years of deliberately dulling her skills. The weight of the knife in her hand felt both foreign and achingly familiar. "Let's see if you even know how to hold that knife properly," Scott commented for the cameras, hovering nearby. Samantha could smell his cologne. Too strong, masking the natural scents a real chef would want to detect in a kitchen. She closed her eyes briefly. Breathe. When her eyelids lifted, something had shifted. Her hands moved before conscious thought, muscle memory awakening like a language she had tried to forget but couldn't. The knife slid through the duck's joints with perfect precision, separating skin from meat in one continuous motion. Samantha began to hum softly, an old Hungarian folk song her grandmother had sung in their kitchen. She hadn't hummed in 8 years. A young student worker assisting with the production leaned against the counter, watching Samantha work. "You look different," the girl said quietly. "Different how?" Samantha asked, not breaking her rhythm as she prepared the duck carcass for the press. "Like, this is who you really are." In the small audience gathered to watch, Myra Griffin, a food blogger invited to cover the event, narrowed her eyes. Something about the way Samantha's hands moved tugged at her memory. The confident handling of the knife, the particular angle of the blade against the cutting board. She had seen this technique before, in another kitchen years ago. As Samantha worked, her movements became fluid, efficient, precise. The trembling stopped. Her shoulders relaxed. The familiar dance of professional cooking returned, the economy of motion that separates home cooks from chefs. Scott, noticing the change, frowned slightly. This wasn't the fumbling attempt he had expected to mock on camera. Have you ever experienced that moment when you reconnect with something you love? That feeling when muscle memory takes over? Tell us in the comments below about a time when your body remembered what your mind had tried to forget. Now, let's see what happens as Samantha continues to reclaim her hidden gifts. As Samantha progressed through the preparation, a transformation unfolded. Not just in the dish taking shape, but in her entire being. The sauce reduction bubbled gently as she added precisely the right amount of cognac without measuring. Her posture had changed. The slight stoop of someone trying to appear smaller had given way to the straight backbone of a chef commanding her station. Inside her mind, 2 voices battled for control. "Stop this now. Hide your skill. They'll recognize you. All the shame will come flooding back." But beneath that voice, a deeper one emerged. "This is who you are. This has always been who you are." The familiar flow state, that transcendent mental space where action and awareness merge, enveloped her. Time simultaneously expanded and contracted. Each step of the complex dish unfolded with a rhythm that came from thousands of hours of practice. Practice she had denied herself for nearly a decade. Scott moved closer, his showman's instinct telling him something was off about this supposed cafeteria cook. He examined her technique as she prepared the duck breasts, the perfect scoring of the skin, the rendering of fat at exactly the right temperature. His eyes narrowed. "Where did you learn that particular technique?" he asked, genuine curiosity breaking through his performance. "My grandmother," Samantha answered truthfully, not looking up. It wasn't the whole truth, of course. Her grandmother had taught her the foundations, but that specific technique for rendering duck fat while maintaining crisp skin had been shown to her by chef Anton Moreau in Paris. The same chef who had mentored Scott's biggest rival, a connection Scott would recognize if he knew enough about classical training. Darla watched from across the kitchen, a mixture of pride and concern on her face. Ken Hopkins, the college president, had abandoned any pretense of administrative duties and stood transfixed by the unexpected display of culinary artistry happening in his institutional kitchen. The press, that magnificent antique silver contraption brought as a prop, was now being used exactly as intended. Samantha turned the handle with reverent precision, extracting the blood and marrow that would form the foundation of the sauce. Her hands moved with such assured grace that several production crew members had stopped filming reaction shots and were simply watching her work. Scott's expression shifted from suspicion to something more complex. As a chef who had clawed his way up through sheer determination rather than formal training, he recognized mastery when he saw it, and what he was witnessing was undeniably mastery. His planned narrative of institutional mediocrity was dissolving before his eyes. "The sauce needs to reduce for exactly 7 minutes, Samantha said, more to herself than anyone else. It was the voice of someone who knew precisely what would happen next, who could visualize the finished dish in perfect detail before it existed. Behind her, Myra Griffin pulled out her phone and began searching through old food blog posts. A suspicion had formed in her mind, one too incredible to trust without verification. The completed dish sat before them, canard à la presa presented with elegant simplicity. The duck breast rested in perfect slices, skin crisp and golden, the sauce a glossy mahogany pool beneath, the subtle aroma of cognac and duck essence rising in delicate wisps of steam. Scott stared at the plate in silence before extracting a fork from his pocket. His personal tasting fork, a chef's superstition. The cameras zoomed in as he cut a precise bite, ensuring it captured both meat and sauce. The forced disdain he had planned to display faltered as the flavors registered. His training told him this was not merely good. It was extraordinary. The balance of flavors, the technical perfection of the execution. But his ego, the persona he had cultivated for television, wouldn't allow him to acknowledge it fully. "The presentation is pedestrian," he said finally, his voice carrying none of its usual conviction. "And the sauce is slightly over-reduced." The sauce was perfect. Everyone who knew anything about classical French cuisine could see that. "No, it isn't," Samantha said quietly, the words escaping before she could stop them. "The sauce is reduced precisely to nap consistency. It will coat the back of a spoon without breaking when you draw your finger through it." A charged silence fell over the kitchen. Scott looked up sharply. "That's a very technical observation for a cafeteria cook." "It's basic sauce technique," Samantha replied, but her voice had changed. The careful modulation of 8 years had slipped, revealing the authoritative tone of someone used to running a professional kitchen. "And what would you know about proper nap consistency?" Scott challenged, an edge of defensiveness creeping into his voice. "I know that you're holding your fork incorrectly for proper tasting," Samantha answered, meeting his eyes directly for the first time. "And that you added the cognac to your demonstration sauce too early, which would have caused the alcohol to burn off completely rather than infuse." The production crew exchanged glances. This wasn't in the script. From the small gathered crowd, Myra Griffin stepped forward, her phone in hand, screen displaying an old magazine cover. "I knew I recognized your hands," she said. Her voice held wonder rather than accusation. "You're Samantha Hyder." The name hung in the air like smoke. Several people gasped. A production assistant whispered urgently into his headset. Scott's expression transformed completely as recognition dawned. Samantha Hyder. Chicago. The Roots disaster. His eyes widened as pieces clicked into place. But you disappeared. Everyone thought you'd left the country. Samantha stood perfectly still, the protective shell of 8 years cracking around her. The secret that had both protected and imprisoned her now lay exposed under the bright lights she had once fled. How? Scott asked, genuine confusion replacing his arrogance. Why are you working in a college cafeteria? Time seemed suspended as Samantha stood at the precipice of her carefully constructed life. 8 years of safety. 8 years of hiding. 8 years of denying her gift. All unraveling in an instant. Her first instinct was to run, to walk out those doors and disappear again. Find another anonymous kitchen, another forgettable name badge, another life where excellence wouldn't expose her to judgment and potential failure. Her car keys were in her pocket. She could be gone before anyone processed what was happening. But as she looked down at the dish she had created, perfect in its execution, honest in its intention, something shifted within her. The weight of pretending to be less than she was suddenly felt heavier than the weight of being seen. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. Food doesn't lie, Sammy. All these years she had been living a lie, but her hands had remembered the truth. The cameras were still rolling. Everyone was waiting for her response. In the frozen moment, Samantha realized she faced not just a choice about what to say, but a choice about who to be for whatever remained of her life. Would she continue hiding from her gifts out of fear? Or would she finally acknowledge the truth that her hands had just demonstrated so clearly? That mastery, once achieved, cannot be completely suppressed. Darla moved protectively toward her, ready to create a diversion if needed. Myra Griffin watched with journalistic interest but unexpected compassion. Ken Hopkins calculated the publicity value of this revelation. And Scott waited with an expression that had lost all its performance quality, revealing instead a fellow chef recognizing another across an unexpected divide. Samantha thought of the box of recipes still sealed in her apartment. Her grandmother's legacy, preserved but unlived. She thought of the students she served daily, never sharing what she actually knew about food as nourishment, as culture, as expression. She closed her eyes briefly and found that the panic she had expected, the same overwhelming anxiety that had driven her from public view years ago, had been replaced by something else. Exhaustion. Not from cooking but from hiding. From denying who she was. Yes, she said finally, opening her eyes. I'm Samantha Hyder. The simple admission seemed to physically transform her. Her shoulders straightened completely. Her voice found its natural register again after years of deliberate softening. I was Samantha Hyder, she clarified. Chef, restaurateur, creator of Roots. Was. And yes, spectacular public failure. The production team had gone completely silent, cameras still rolling but all pretense of the original show concept abandoned. This was unscripted gold. After everything collapsed, I couldn't bear the scrutiny, the mockery, the analysis of what went wrong and why I wasn't worthy of the recognition I'd received. She gestured around the institutional kitchen. Here, no one expected anything special. That felt safe. Scott set down his fork, genuine humility crossing his features, an expression his viewers would never have recognized. Your duck is perfect, he said quietly. Better than I could have made it. From anyone else, it might have seemed like a small acknowledgement. But from Scott Todd, known for never admitting anyone's culinary superiority on camera, it was extraordinary. Why? He asked, the single word containing multiple questions. Because failure isn't just professional in our world, Samantha answered, understanding exactly what he was asking. It becomes your identity. She's the one who couldn't handle the pressure. She's the one who wasn't as good as everyone thought. I couldn't separate the chef I was from the failure I became. Ken Hopkins stepped forward, administrative instinct overriding his awe. Ms. Hyder, Sam. Perhaps we should continue this conversation privately. The students will be arriving for lunch soon. But the students were already there. Word had spread through campus that something unusual was happening in the cafeteria. Dozens of young faces pressed against the windows, watching their ordinary lunch lady revealed as culinary royalty. Myra Griffin, recognizing the historical significance of the moment, had been quietly recording on her phone. "People have been wondering what happened to you for years," she said. "Your disappearance became a cautionary tale in culinary schools." "I'm not a cautionary tale," Samantha said with quiet dignity. "I'm a human being who experienced a very public failure and didn't know how to survive it any other way." Darla moved to stand beside her. "She's also the most talented cook I've ever met. And I've been feeding people for 45 years. Scott looked from the perfect dish to the woman who had created it. "Would you?" He hesitated, theatrical persona completely abandoned. "Would you be willing to come on my show? Not as a challenge, but to tell your story." Samantha's laugh held no humor. "That's what I've been running from. Cameras, expectations, judgment." "Maybe that's exactly why you should do it," Myra suggested gently. "To reclaim the narrative. On your terms this time." The next few days passed in a blur. Once news broke that the long-disappeared Samantha Hyder had been found working in a community college cafeteria, the media machine roared back to life. Food magazines that had once written her professional obituary now clamored for exclusive interviews. Former colleagues reached out with messages that ranged from genuinely supportive to transparently opportunistic. Samantha called in sick to work for the first time in 8 years, retreating to her apartment as panic threatened to overwhelm her again. The carefully constructed walls of her new identity had not just cracked, they had shattered completely. "I can't do this again," she told Darla, who had come to check on her. The scrutiny, the expectations, the possibility of disappointing people. Darla settled into Samantha's worn couch, surveying the sparse apartment with its conspicuous lack of cooking equipment. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to do," she said firmly. "But consider this. You spent 8 years hiding your light. What if you spent even a fraction of that time sharing it instead?" Myra Griffin had appointed herself as Samantha's unofficial media buffer, screening requests and turning away the more sensationalist outlets. She arrived that afternoon with surprising news. "You've become something of a symbol," she explained, showing Samantha her phone. "Look at these hashtags." Young chefs and culinary students were sharing stories of their own professional setbacks, citing Samantha as inspiration that a career wasn't defined by its worst moment. Her unintentional re-emergence had sparked a conversation about mental health in high-pressure kitchens and the human cost of culinary celebrity. "They're finding hope in your story," Myra said quietly. "Not because you're perfect, because you're not." That evening, Samantha finally opened the box of her grandmother's recipes. The familiar handwriting brought tears as she traced the faded ink with her fingertips. These weren't just instructions for cooking. They were her heritage, her foundation, the blueprint of her first understanding that food could be love made tangible. The recipe on top was for a simple Hungarian bread, the first thing her grandmother had taught her to make. Samantha found herself gathering the few basic ingredients she had on hand. Not to impress anyone. Not for cameras or critics or validation. Simply because her hands remembered what they were made to do. 2 weeks later, Scott Todd appeared at the cafeteria during off hours. No cameras. No production team. No red bandana battle flag. Just a chef in ordinary clothes, carrying a bottle of expensive cognac. Samantha had returned to work, though everything had changed. Students asked for selfies. Faculty members who had never acknowledged her existence now wanted cooking tips. Ken Hopkins was already planning a culinary program with her reluctant input. "I thought you might need this after service," Scott said, placing the bottle on the prep table. Professional courtesy. Samantha studied him, searching for the performative arrogance she'd witnessed during filming. Instead, she found something unexpected. Genuine respect, perhaps even contrition. The episode isn't going to air, he said. At least, not in its original form. Why not? Seems like ratings gold. The great Scott Todd accidentally challenges a Michelin star chef. There was no bitterness in her voice, just weary acknowledgement of media reality. Scott leaned against the counter. Because it wasn't the story I wanted to tell. He paused. Or maybe it was exactly the story I needed to hear. In the quiet kitchen, an unlikely conversation unfolded between two chefs who had taken very different paths through the culinary world. One who had turned failure into a performance of perpetual success, and another who had turned success into a deliberate embrace of anonymity. Both hiding in their own ways. I never went to culinary school, Scott confessed, the admission visibly difficult for him. Everything I know I taught myself or learned on the job. I've spent my entire career terrified someone would discover I don't belong. Samantha absorbed this, recognizing in his confession the mirror image of her own fear. I've spent 8 years terrified someone would discover I do, she replied. From the walk-in refrigerator, Samantha retrieved a container of soup. Her grandmother's recipe, made that morning during a quiet moment before dawn. She warmed 2 portions, pouring them into simple white bowls. No garnish, no presentation, just honest food offered as bridge between 2 people who understood each other's private battles. They ate in companionable silence, the rich broth speaking volumes that words couldn't express. What will you do now? God finally asked. Samantha considered the question that had haunted her since her identity had been revealed. I'm not sure yet. But I think it's time to unpack a few more recipes. 3 months later, a transformed corner of the cafeteria hummed with activity. Copper pots hung alongside institutional steel. A small group of students gathered around a flour-dusted table where Samantha stood with her hands immersed in bread dough. Not too much kneading, she instructed. Feel the gluten developing. The dough will tell you when it's ready. The Culinary Fundamentals program had started small, just an after-hours workshop for interested students. But word had spread beyond campus. Community members signed up. A waiting list formed. What began as redemption had evolved into something Samantha hadn't anticipated. Purpose. She wore no chef's whites, no formal uniform, just an apron with a college logo and a simple name tag that now read Samantha Hyder. Not a declaration of her past achievements, but an acknowledgement of her whole self. The unpacked box of her grandmother's recipes sat open on a nearby shelf. Each week, she selected one to teach. Not in its original form but as a starting point for understanding fundamental techniques. The recipes weren't sacred texts anymore, but living documents that connected past to present. A student looked up from her kneading. Chef Hyder, how do we know when it's right? When something we make is good. Samantha paused, flour dusting her hands like chalk on a blackboard. 8 years ago, she would have answered with technical precision. Now, hard-won wisdom shaped her response. When it feels like truth, she said finally. When you've put something real into the world that wasn't there before. She pressed her hands into the bread dough, leaving an impression that slowly filled itself in. Perfect technique matters. But authenticity matters more. As the students returned to their work, Samantha began to hum that same Hungarian folk song, no longer a slip of her hidden self, but a deliberate expression of who she had always been and was finally allowing herself to become again. Isn't it beautiful how our gifts find ways to resurface, even when we try to bury them? If this story moved you, please subscribe to Genie Soul Stories for more narratives about hidden brilliance and second chances. And tell us below, what part of yourself are you ready to reclaim?